Please welcome Marcel Pociot.
Wow. Hey. Hey, everyone. That's a lot of smoke. All right. So the screaming part was kind of good, but I guess we're all a bit full. So everyone get up. Come on. I'm not kidding. Get up. OK, so. All right, cool. So we're going to do 5 crunches. All right? Come on, do it with me. 1. OK, cool. 2. Yeah, very good. 3, you can do. 4, 1 more. OK, that's awesome. Cool. All right. So you can catch my Getting Fit with Laravel course on Laracast later this year. OK, cool. So my talk's called No More Slow Requests. I'm Marcel Pociot. You can follow me on all kinds of social media, even though I'm most active on Twitter or X, and post about PHP, Laravel kind of stuff mostly. And I'm the CTO/co-founder/developer. It's all a funky way of titles for a 3-people company at Beyond Code, where we create software tools for developers, software tools for people like myself, people like you, hopefully. So we created Tinkerwell, which is sort of like PHP Artisan Tinker, a GUI built around this. So if you use Tinker a lot, check it out. You can tinker with code and run code at your local projects or remote projects. And Dee also showed that in her talk. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. Then we also created Expose. Expose is like a tunneling solution, pretty much like ngrok, that allows you to share your local sites with clients or colleagues or use it to test webhooks. It's entirely built in PHP, which was a fun challenge to do. It's entirely open source, so if you want to check that out, do that on GitHub. And we're currently very busy on working on the version 3, which will be out very soon as well. And last but not least, we are working on Laravel Herd, which has become the easiest way to get started with Laravel on your computer. So if you want to set up a new device or switch from brew dependency hell breaking randomly, check out Herd. All right. Cool. All right, so in preparation for this talk, I was asking on social media for reasons of other people's why their Laravel applications become slow. And I want to basically gather like the top 4 responses that I got overall. Any guesses what the number 1 is? Database. That's right. So it was anything between too many queries, not using proper indexes, N+1 issues, all sorts of stuff. So database was definitely the number 1. Number 2 was HTTP requests. So outgoing HTTP requests to third-party APIs. So for example, people using the GitHub APIs or something like that, and then those APIs just slow down the whole request response lifecycle. The last one was queued jobs, or, well, to be precise, queued jobs that were not queued, so things that should be pushed off to the queue but weren't. And last but not least, we got PHP itself, but there's a little disclaimer here. Well, first of all, this is running JavaScript, apparently. And PHP itself, it wasn't the language, but more like weird constructs where people had to serialize a lot of data, and then that became slow. So it wasn't really the language, just what people do with the language, I would say. And from more than 100 responses over all the social media accounts, what I found very interesting is that not a single one was Laravel. So nobody actually said the framework is the reason that my application is slow. Nobody, besides these weird edge cases, said it's the language I'm coding at that is slow. So I think we can all agree that PHP and Laravel, even with things like Octane, you can run your websites very fast, so that's not really an issue. And if there is an issue in the framework, it will be fixed very fast anyway. So let me go through a couple of basic things. And when I was preparing this talk, I thought this was very basic, and then I went through the list of things and noticed that we should do a bunch of these things as well. So the first one, PHP Artisan Optimize. I know what you might think. Everyone knows that. I thought PHP Artisan Optimize is in the default deployment script of Forge. It isn't. So chances are that if you're using Forge and you haven't modified your deployment script, it's not in there, so you should try and check that. What PHP Artisan Optimize does under the hood is it runs a couple of, well, optimization commands that cache things in your application. So things like the cache, the config, the views, the events, and the routes. Now, there's one catch. If you do this in production, then calls to the env helper will not work. So this means you have to use the config helper if you want to retrieve something from your environment file, which I think is the reason why this is not in the default Forge deployment script. But you should definitely do that. Because then the framework no longer has to parse through your routes file and stuff to find things. It's all cached and condensed. What I found really interesting is that you can also hook into this yourself. So if your application needs to warm up a cache, for example, after every deployment, or if your application needs to, I don't know, pre-generate some files, whatever, you can hook into this using the optimizes function call in a service provider. And then you provided basically two commands. The one command is that runs whenever you run PHP Artisan Optimize. And the other command that is the one that gets called, well, sort of to revert the optimization step. And what's really nice about this is that this also works for packages. So if you are a package maintainer and whatever your package does can make benefits of an optimization step, you can just add this to your package service provider. And then the next time the user of your package runs PHP Artisan Optimize, your commands will be in that list, which I think is really nice. OK, next up, use your queues. And again, it might be a simple thing, but what I mostly stumble upon in our applications is we send out mails. And we send out mails using mail::send. And by default, this is what you get when you run PHP Artisan make mail. And you can see that it uses the queuable trait, but by default, the mails are not being pushed to the queue. So to fix this, we just have to implement the should-queue interface. And that ensures that it doesn't matter if you run mail::queue or mail::send. The mails will always be pushed to the queue. And I don't really think there's a good reason why you should send your mails in the request-response lifecycle, because if something breaks, like if the API you're using, like Postmark or SendGrid or whatever, if they have an issue and give you a 500 back, your user will get the 500. Or if the email is a hard bounce, then you just throw the 500 error in the user's face. So I think mails should be queued by default, and it's a simple thing. I submitted a PR to Laravel to kind of add some logic so that mails can be queued by default. We still have to figure out if we want to do this, I guess, and if Taylor wants to do this. But I think this would be really nice, and the same applies to notifications. So if you have notifications, those should be on the queue as well all the time. Next one, opcache. The way opcache works, or the way PHP works in general, is we go to the browser, make a request to a server, and then the server basically checks for each file that we somehow require or includes in our request, like in our Laravel application, like the whole vendor folder, basically. It's going to check, is the PHP file cached? On the first request, or if opcache is not enabled, it's not. So PHP is going to parse the file, like the actual PHP code. Then it's going to compile the PHP code into bytecode. This bytecode with opcache would be stored. Then we execute the bytecode, and then we send the response back to the server. And depending on how many files you have, and given that PHP and Laravel includes a whole bunch of files in the vendor folder, this can become quite slow. So with opcache enabled, we basically skip all these 3 steps, because we hit the server, PHP knows that the, index PHP file is in cache, and then it's just going to execute the bytecode loaded from cache, and then send it as a response. And the way this is so fast with opcache is that opcache stores it in a shared memory, so it doesn't even need to access files. There is a file storage sort of as a fallback, but it's all in memory, which makes it super fast. And again, I was under the impression I prepared all my sites, and I did that. And I'm not going to tell you which site it was, but there might be a site that I had which had an average response time of 300 milliseconds without opcache. Then I enabled opcache, and it went down to 90 milliseconds, which is quite a lot. And now you might think, well, how do I enable opcache? If you use Forge, just click that damn button. Like, if there's one thing you take away from that talk, click that button. Besides some very weird edge cases, there aren't really any downsides. If you're not using Forge, add that to your PHP ini file, reload PHP, and you're using opcache. So yeah, I think you should do that because it speeds up and eats less resources and makes everything faster. All right, so now we're going to jump into some demo stuff. And I have prepared this little demo application. I'm a huge board game nerd. I like to play board games besides Monopoly and Uno that, I don't know, if a board game takes more than 2 hours, I'm in. I really like that kind of stuff. And I thought it would be nice to, because at Beyond Code, we're not all at the same place, so we kind of play board games online, which is a thing. It's pretty cool. It doesn't sound cool, but it is. So I thought it would be nice to have some sort of online meetup for developers to hang out, and then afterwards they can mingle and play some games. Anyway, that's kind of the app. So we have users. Each user has a favorite game. Then we have a list of games. Each game has just a rating, and then we have the amount of times that a game was played. And then we have a dashboard where we just show the overall count of our games, the overall count of our users, and then the top 100 users. So let's start with the users page. And the way this looks, if we jump into the code, is like this. So we just have the user controller. We paginate the users. We return the index blade for our users. And if we take a look at the view, we can see that we output the username, as well as the favorite game image and the favorite game name. Now, something should now be screaming in your head that this is not good, because this introduces n+1 queries. Because when we look at the debug bar and take a look at the queries we're executing, it's 17 queries, so 1 to get all the users, and then in the loop in our blade file, we basically fetch the favorite game of each user inside of the loop. So we have all these queries to get that favorite game. And we should try and avoid that. And there are multiple ways we can do this in Laravel. So if we go to the controller, one thing we can do is we can say, well, we want to get the users with the favorite game. And this tells just Eloquent to ego load the favorite game relationship and then paginate it. And now if we refresh, we only have 3 queries. So the count, which is used for the pagination, then we have the users, and then we have 1 single query for all the games to get the favorite ones. All right, that's pretty nice. That's what we wanted to achieve. The other way we can do this is by moving that logic into the model itself. So we can say that in our model, we want to have something like this, and we say we always want to load the favorite game relationship whenever we load a user from our database. And here in the UI, it's the same thing. So we execute the exact same queries. I would always highly advise you to not use this approach, I'm going to show you why in just a second. It works the same way, but I think this is kind of dangerous and can lead to a lot of performance issues down the line. One other thing, if we just quickly get rid of this again, you can do is in your application service provider, you can tell Laravel to actually prevent lazy loading. So we don't want the framework to even allow us to do this. And as the second argument, or as the first argument, you can pass a Boolean flag if this should be disabled and prevented or not. And this is like the default that you can copy out of the documentation, which I think is very sensible, because this prevents lazy loading if the application is not in production. So this means that if someone, of course not you, someone ships code that performs an n+1 query, then your site will still work. It will just be slow. So it's always just better to have a couple more queries instead of just showing 500 errors. And the way this works, if I refresh the site, we now get an exception, so a lazy loading violation exception that tells us we tried to lazy load the favorite game on the user model, but it's disabled. OK? So let's leave that in place, and now we add this back, and now it's good again. OK, so let's check out the games. And we already get the exception, which is good. That's what we wanted to show that. So it's telling us that the played games relationship is being lazy loaded. So let's go to the game controller. There we are. So we just query the games, sort them by rating, paginate them. And then in here, you can see to display the count of the played games, we're using, once again, lazy loading, which causes an n+1 issue. Now, one of your developers, not yourself, of course, might go in and do this. So they might say, OK, well, I'm just counting on the query builder of the relationship. And you might think that this is being caught by the lazy loading prevention as well, which it isn't, because technically it's not lazy loading. So Laravel, the framework, doesn't really know that we are doing something we're not supposed to do, because we're just running a ton of queries on the query builder instead of lazy loading something. So yeah, the right way to fix this would be in here, we basically just say we want to query the games with the count of our played games relationship. And then in our view, we can just say played games count. And now if we check the queries, we're down to 2. So we only have the count for the pagination, and then we have one single query for all the data we need. So just be sure that even though you have prevent lazy loading in your service provider, doesn't mean that you're completely safe from n+1 queries. OK, now go to the dashboard. The dashboard is kind of simple. So in the dashboard controller, all we do is we get the total count of users and the total count of games. And then for the top users, these are basically the users that played the most amount of games. So we use the played games relationships. So we want the count of this relationship. And then we sort our users by the played games count descending. And then we take 100. And if we take a look at it, it's quite good. So we have 4 queries. And we can see that we have the users. We have a count of the games. And we have a count of users. And, well, suddenly we have this huge query with all the games. And that's pretty much why I think you should never use the with property on your models. Because now, even though we don't care about the games, we are eagle-loading the favorite game of all the 100 user models that we show on the dashboard, even though we don't care about it, because it's in our model. So I would advise you to always just explicitly eagle-load whenever you need to, instead of doing it in the model itself. Because especially with more nested models, this is going to bite you in the end. So like this. All right, so now one other thing. Let's say that instead of showing the top 100 users, you want to show all of them, or like say the top 10,000 users. So let's go to the dashboard controller again. And in here, we're not showing the 100, but we're showing 10,000 users. So right now, we have 100 models. It takes about 2 megabytes of memory and 40 milliseconds. And if I refresh, With 10,000 users, there's now, of course, we have 10,000 models. Memory is now much higher because we have to store all these models in memory. And our request duration also spiked up to 100 milliseconds. But if we take a look at the view, all we really need is the name of the user. Like in this situation, or if you think of something like huge data exports, where you don't really need the entire model, it's better to just plug the data that we want. So instead, what we can do is, instead of getting a collection of users, we can just say that we want to plug the name. And now we have to modify our dashboard so that now we don't have a collection of user models, but this is now a collection of strings. So if we get rid of this, it should be the same result, but memory right now 20 megabytes and 108 milliseconds. And now it goes down to, something like 50, 60 milliseconds, 13 megabytes of memory, and we don't have any models hydrated. And this might not be an issue for you for like web requests, but especially for things that run like larger exports, it might be necessary to watch the memory usage and memory consumption, so it might be better to just plug the data that you need instead of pulling down all the models. All right, another one. We have an API as well. So we have an API for users, and as you can see, it's kind of slow. So it takes a couple seconds to reload. And if we take a look at the controller, there's nothing special going on, really. So we take all the users with the favorite game relationship, only the first 10, and then we just return them. And now you might wonder, why is this request slow? So you start maybe doing DDs in here, refresh, and that's instant, which is weird. So there must be something else going on. So you take a look in the model. There's nothing really here, so maybe it's in the game model. And then we have this appends attribute on our model. This basically tells Laravel, whenever we have a model and we transform it into an array or into JSON, it's going to append an attribute. So this is not visible if we dump this out, if we pass it to a view. This will only be appended for the JSON or array representation. And in here, we're doing an HTTP request, which we shouldn't do. Like, we should, if we want to add something like that, it should be, I don't know, like populated every night through a query or something like that, or at least be cached. But we're doing it. And figuring this stuff out can be really tricky. Like in this situation where it's just two models, that's easy. But if you have a lot of nested models where you're doing some of the append stuff, this can become quite tricky. So the way we can do this is we can make use of a profiler extension. And there are a couple of extensions out there for PHPs, like Xdebug has a profiler included. But I'm a real fan of SPX, which is another great extension, because Xdebug, even if I don't enable it, it still slows down my application, which I don't like. I want it to be as fast as possible. And with SPX, that's not the case. So SPX can be enabled all the time. It doesn't slow down anything, and only if I want to use it, I can add it. So the way you can install SPX is, if you're using herd, it's just a one-line bash script. It downloads it for all the extensions that you have. If you're not using herd, you have to download the extension yourself and then enable it in your PHP ini file. And what's so cool about SPX is it gives you a web UI. So you can hit a route. With herd, again, we make it a little bit simpler. You can hit a herd profiler route, which redirects you to the web UI of SPX. And in here, I can basically start and say, we want to automatically start profiling requests. And that's all we need to do. So it's like available the entire time. I just toggle it on now. Let's get rid of the DD. Oh, we did. Cool. All right, let's refresh. And now if we go back, we have one entry. So we profiled this one request. And now if we click on this, we get more in-depth information about what happened in this one request. And I know it's a lot. It's a lot of red, especially. And these informations can be kind of tricky to read. But Right here, it's a bit simpler. So we can see that the curl handler was invoked a ton of times, and the game is hot closure was called a bunch of times, which helps us. But this is not always the case, so it can be a bit tricky to figure out. I was just playing around because there's a cool React library that allows you to basically hook some sort of ChatGPT functionality into your apps. And I just played around with that, so I can do something like, why is my request slow? And then it's going to hopefully not come up with a bunch of garbage, but with the actual results. So we basically feed it the data from the profiler, and then you can, just like ChatGPT, chat with your profile data, which I think is really cool, because the amount of times I spent scrolling in here and trying to figure out what the hell is happening in all this data. So yeah, we haven't shipped this yet, but I think this is really cool and helps you speed up figuring out bottlenecks in your application. OK, now what if you want to profile a command line application? So we also have a command called profile me, where we do the same thing. It also pulls down the first 10 users and then turns it into an array. And as you can see, it's kind of slow. So how can we measure and see what's going on? Again, with Herd, we make it a bit easier. If you're not using Herd, you can also do this yourself. So with Herd, you can run Herd Profiler, which is basically an alias for PHP. So I can run Herd Profiler artisan profile me. Profile, that's it. There we go. And now it's going to profile the profile me artisan command and gives me a CLI representation of what I just saw in the web UI. So I can see that the curl handler was causing a lot of downtime, and a lot of seconds went into that. And if we run it again, yeah, now it also shows up the is hot. It can be a bit flaky. And this is especially useful if you have long-running commands that you want to profile. So think of something like reverb, or if you have any kind of PHP daemon. This can be really tricky to profile if there are memory leaks in there. And with SPX, or her profile as well, you can just add -- live. Then we got a real-time output as our command is running, and see in real time where we lose memory, where we take up a lot of time. And this really helps identify leaks or just memory-related issues in CLI applications. So yeah, that's basically how we can do with local applications. We use profilers. But if we want to profile our applications that run in production, then I guess we have to wait for Laravel Nightwatch, which Jess is going to talk more about tomorrow. And I can't wait to use this on our products as well. So I think this is going to give us a lot of great insights. That's all that I have. So I hope that you learned a bit, learned how to profile your apps. Again, click that button on Forge and then enable opcache, and maybe make sure that PHP Artisan Optimize is in your deployment script. Thank you very much.
You know what I'm here for.
Yeah, for the anonymous user.
Let's see if he has something for you. Before that amazing guy, Pavelas is asking, any examples when opcache should be enabled? And why it's disabled by default?
Well, I'm not sure why it's disabled by default. I guess you have to go to the Forge booth, get your stamp, and ask them a question. I'm not sure why. Like there might be some very rare edge cases why an opcache might bite you, but in my experience, this is mostly when you misconfigure it, which shouldn't happen on Forge. And the other question was if I have examples of
when opcache should be any examples when opcache should be enabled? Shouldn't be.
Oh, shouldn't be. Oh, no. Well, yeah, I think it's mostly if you can misconfigure it and give it too much memory to write into, then you might run into problems. But yeah, for the apps that we use, we just enable it, and it's good.
OK. Thank you. And Stefan is asking, how would you profile queue jobs with Herd?
For queue jobs, it's kind of the same thing as I showed with the CLI profiler. You could just profile the job runner, basically the queue worker, with the --live, and then see the output there, or use any of the local queue workers. Yeah,
That would work.
Anonymous.
The anonymous user.
Yeah.
He's asking, it's a tricky question. He's asking, when will Herd go to Linux?
Oh, it's redacted.
It's not.
It's redacted.
It's redacted. Oh, good date. Oh, that's a good. That's a good date.
Yeah.
Big applause for Marcel. Thank you. That way.